The command deck of the Council carrier Veyron was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of consoles and the occasional static-laden updates from surrounding outposts. Through the expansive viewing screen, the stars stretched endlessly, their serene light a stark contrast to the tension gripping the room. Admiral Aaron Vass stood at the helm, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, scanning the array of holographic displays. The stillness of the vast chamber belied the storm brewing in his mind. A single, pulsating green icon blinked ominously on the main screen, its trajectory cutting a direct line toward Council space. "Admiral, confirmation just came in," Lieutenant Derek Venner announced from his station, his tone clipped. "It's them, the humans." Vass's jaw tightened as he turned to the young officer. "One ship?" "Yes, sir." One Venner's fingers danced over the console, bringing up a magnified image. The vessel was unlike anything the Council had encountered before. Sleek, unmarked, and almost unsettlingly simple. No energy fluctuations, no discernible weapon systems. Just a quiet approach through the void. Vass's boots clicked softly on the polished metal floor as he moved closer to the display. His dark eyes narrowed, scanning the enigmatic ship. He had seen countless vessels in his decades of service. Warships, cargo freighters, reconnaissance units. But this was different. "What do we know about it?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. "Almost nothing, sir." Venner exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his voice. "Its hull composition is standard alloy, but there's some kind of interference blocking deeper scans. Propulsion systems don't match anything in our records. No crew life signs detected yet, but the design suggests this isn't an automated drone. It's—" He hesitated, struggling for the right words. "Out of place," Vass finished for him. "Yes, Admiral." A flicker of unease passed through the bridge. The Council had spent years monitoring humanity's sudden rise. What began as sporadic expeditions into the stars had transformed, almost overnight, into the establishment of self-sustaining colonies. And then, silence. 50 years without so much as a whisper. Until now. "Course?" Vass prompted, his tone sharper now. "Directly for Celis Prime, sir," Venner replied. "They'll breach the border in 6 hours if their speed holds." The Admiral straightened, his shoulders squared. 6 hours isn't long to determine if this is a peace envoy or the vanguard of something far worse. Assemble the High Command on the bridge in 10 minutes. I want every scenario planned. "Yes, sir." Before Venner could leave, another officer, Lieutenant Orrin Jass, glanced up from his console, his voice breaking the tension. "Admiral, their approach vector, it's deliberate, almost like they want us to see them coming." Vass's gaze snapped to Jass, his mind calculating. "Expand." Jass's fingers flew over his console, enlarging the trajectory data. "They're not taking the most direct route. It's as if they're sending a message. Confidence, maybe?" "Confidence or arrogance?" Vass muttered. He stared at the approaching ship, his mind racing with possibilities. He turned to Venner. "I need analysis on their movements and every known detail on their recent activity. If this ship is some sort of decoy or distraction, I want to know. And if it's not?" Jass asked cautiously. Vass's lips thinned into a grim line. "Then we have to figure out why humanity, after decades of silence, has chosen to send just one ship into the heart of Council space, and we'll have to do it before they arrive." The bridge fell silent again, save for the hum of data streams and the soft clatter of keys. Vass turned back to the screen, his eyes locked on the mysterious vessel that continued its deliberate, unhurried path. A single ship, no escort, no backup, and no warning. Whatever humanity's game was, Aaron Vass knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to be simple. The war room aboard the Veyron buzzed with subdued tension. Holograms projected star charts and tactical displays that flickered against the dim lighting. Around the central table, a mix of seasoned officers and intelligence specialists exchanged sharp glances, their discussions punctuated by rapid updates from their stations. Admiral Aaron Vass stood at the head of the table, silent but observant, his presence alone enough to steady the room. "Report," Vass commanded, breaking the murmurs. Lieutenant Venner stepped forward, his datapad glowing faintly in the low light. Admiral, the Resolute's trajectory remains unchanged. Estimated time to border breach, 5 hours and 43 minutes. No deviations, no communication attempts. Commander Farron Lore, a stocky veteran with a sharp tongue, leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table's edge. It's either the boldest bluff I've seen or the most reckless move imaginable. What kind of species sends a lone ship into our territory without even trying to establish terms? Humans, apparently, Venner quipped, before catching himself under Voss's steady glare. Voss turned his attention to the hologram, the single green dot glowing like a taunt amidst the sea of neutral space. What's the consensus, gentlemen? Is this ship bait, or does it carry something more dangerous? Dran Kuhl, an intelligence analyst known for his cautious demeanor, cleared his throat. Admiral, the lack of obvious defenses or escorts is deliberate. It projects confidence, arrogance perhaps, but also control. They want us to focus on it. That ship is the message. Control, Voss echoed, his voice neutral but probing. And what does that tell you? Kuhl hesitated. It suggests they believe the Resolute is beyond our ability to counter, either through its technology or its mission. They're gambling we won't act rashly. Commander Lore scoffed, his grizzled face creasing with disdain. A gamble indeed. A single barrage from the fleet could turn that ship to slag. And what if it's carrying something we can't predict? Voss interjected, his tone cutting through Lore's bravado. Biological agents? A weaponized AI? Or worse, what if destroying it sets off a chain reaction designed to cripple us? Silence fell over the room as the weight of his words sank in. Lieutenant Jass, seated at the far end, leaned forward hesitantly. Admiral, perhaps they're not here to provoke. What if this is a genuine diplomatic overture? A show of good faith? Lore barked a laugh. Diplomatic overtures don't come unannounced and without contingencies. This reeks of an ulterior motive. Voss raised a hand, silencing the debate. Enough speculation. We need facts. Venner, any progress on penetrating their interference field? None, sir, Venner admitted. Our scanners are being redirected, almost like they're bouncing off a mirror. It's precise. Every time we adjust frequencies, they counter. Voss's gaze hardened. Then stop trying to punch through it. Focus on mapping its edges. If they've constructed a wall, I want to know exactly how far it stretches and where it might be weakest. Yes, Admiral, Venner replied, moving swiftly to relay the orders. Lore leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. If you ask me, they're playing with fire. The Council isn't known for patience, and the longer they stay silent, the more likely we'll see a trigger-happy faction act out. Which is precisely why we won't make the first move, Voss said firmly. His tone was absolute, brooking no dissent. The table quieted as the weight of his command settled. Yet beneath the surface, unease simmered. What kind of power, Voss wondered, allowed a species to walk into the lion's den with nothing but a single vessel? As the officers filed out to their stations, Voss lingered by the hologram. The green dot pulsed steadily, unyielding and enigmatic. Whatever humanity's plan was, they had calculated every move. Now it was his turn to calculate his own. Prepare the fleet, Voss said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Let's see how far their confidence carries them. The command deck's lights dimmed as Admiral Aaron Voss stared at the holographic display. The Resolute remained unchanged, a lone green dot amidst a sea of waiting Council warships. It was an unnerving sight. One ship standing still, unshaken, as though it knew something they didn't. Around him the air buzzed faintly with the murmur of the crew, their movements sharp, measured, like the ticks of a precise clock. Admiral, the fleet is on standby, Lieutenant Venner said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of tension. No further anomalies from the Resolute, but, sir, their silence feels calculated. Calculated, Voss echoed softly, his eyes fixed on the hologram. The word hung in the air like a blade suspended over them all. A flicker of movement caught his attention on the side panel. Drones. Small, nearly imperceptible blips began to appear, spiraling away from the Resolute. Venner leaned forward, adjusting the screen. "Unmanned probes," Venner announced. "They're deploying dozens of them. No recognizable signal patterns." The probes drifted like seeds on a cosmic wind, fanning out in an elegant yet unpredictable formation. They reflected faint light from distant stars, turning them into tiny silver orbs. Vass watched their movements closely, noting how they avoided overlapping paths, their trajectories like the silent choreography of an unseen hand. "Are they scanning us?" he asked sharply. Lieutenant Jass glanced up from his station. "Negative, sir. No signals directed toward our ships. If anything, they're mapping the surrounding space. They're looking for something." "Looking for what?" Vass murmured, but no one had an answer. The Resolute itself remained an enigma. Its hull seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a black so deep it felt unnatural, as though it existed outside the boundaries of physical reality. The absence of visible weapons, the lack of identifiable systems, it all felt deliberate, a silence more deafening than any battle cry. "Admiral, incoming transmission!" Venner called out, snapping Voss's focus back to the present. The bridge fell silent. The transmission wasn't a voice, but a single, flickering symbol that appeared on the main screen. A spiral, simple yet unsettling, twisting inward like the grasp of an unseen force. "What does it mean?" Jass asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Voss clenched his jaw. "It's not for us to understand. It's for us to react to. And I don't like being forced into reaction." His sharp tone cut through the room. The officers shifted uneasily, their movements small but telling. The tension wasn't fear, it was something heavier, the weight of an opponent who refused to play by any known rules. The probes, still scattered across the void, began to pulse faintly. Not light. Something deeper, a vibration that hummed in the bones, a sensation that wasn't quite sound but still resonated. Vass stiffened, his teeth gritting against the invasive feeling. "Admiral," Venner said, his face pale as he studied the readings, "those pulses, they're calibrating to our fleet's positions. It's as if they're probing us, testing us without firing a single shot," Vass finished, his voice hard. The symbol on the screen disappeared as abruptly as it had arrived. The probes stopped pulsing, now drifting aimlessly, like discarded thoughts. The Resolute remained still, its unreadable intent driving tension deeper into the marrow of the room. Vass turned to his officers, his voice steely. "Send word to the Council. This isn't an envoy. It's a declaration. We're being studied, dissected. Whatever they're planning, it's already begun." He turned back to the hologram, watching the solitary dot in the void, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. The humans hadn't fired a shot, hadn't issued a threat, but they had set the stage for something far greater. Voss could feel it, like the distant tremor of an oncoming storm. The command deck's lights dimmed as Admiral Aaron Vass stared at the holographic display. The Resolute remained unchanged, a lone green dot amidst a sea of waiting Council warships. It was an unnerving sight, one ship standing still, unshaken, as though it knew something they didn't. Around him the air buzzed faintly with the murmur of the crew, their movements sharp, measured, like the ticks of a precise clock. "Admiral, the fleet is on standby," Lieutenant Venner said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of tension. "No further anomalies from the Resolute, but, sir, their silence feels calculated." "Calculated," Vass echoed softly, his eyes fixed on the hologram. The word hung in the air like a blade suspended over them all. A flicker of movement caught his attention on the side panel. Drones. Small, nearly imperceptible blips began to appear, spiraling away from the Resolute. Venner leaned forward, adjusting the screen. "Unmanned probes," Venner announced. "They're deploying, dozens of them. No recognizable signal patterns." The probes drifted like seeds on a cosmic wind, fanning out in an elegant yet unpredictable formation. They reflected faint light from distant stars, turning them into tiny silver orbs. Vass watched their movements closely, noting how they avoided overlapping paths, their trajectories like the silent choreography of an unseen hand. "Are they scanning us?" he asked sharply. Lieutenant Jass glanced up from his station. "Negative, sir. No signals directed toward our ships. If anything, they're mapping the surrounding space. They're looking for something." "Looking for what?" Vass murmured, but no one had an answer. The Resolute itself remained an enigma. Its hull seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a black so deep it felt unnatural, as though it existed outside the boundaries of physical reality. The absence of visible weapons, the lack of identifiable systems, it all felt deliberate, a silence more deafening than any battle cry. "Admiral, incoming transmission!" Venner called out, snapping Vass's focus back to the present. The bridge fell silent. The transmission wasn't a voice, but a single flickering symbol that appeared on the main screen. A spiral, simple, yet unsettling, twisting inward like the grasp of an unseen force. "What does it mean?" Jass asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Vass clenched his jaw. "It's not for us to understand. It's for us to react to, and I don't like being forced into reaction." His sharp tone cut through the room. The officers shifted uneasily, their movements small but telling. The tension wasn't fear. It was something heavier, the weight of an opponent who refused to play by any known rules. The probes, still scattered across the void, began to pulse faintly. Not light, something deeper, a vibration that hummed in the bones, a sensation that wasn't quite sound but still resonated. Vass stiffened, his teeth gritting against the invasive feeling. "Admiral," Venner said, his face pale as he studied the readings, "those pulses, they're calibrating to our fleet's positions. It's as if they're probing us, testing us without firing a single shot," Vass finished, his voice hard. The symbol on the screen disappeared as abruptly as it had arrived. The probe stopped pulsing, now drifting aimlessly, like discarded thoughts. The Resolute remained still, its unreadable intent driving tension deeper into the marrow of the room. Vass turned to his officers, his voice steely. "Send word to the Council. This isn't an envoy. It's a declaration. We're being studied, dissected. Whatever they're planning, it's already begun." He turned back to the hologram, watching the solitary dot in the void, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. The humans hadn't fired a shot, hadn't issued a threat, but they had set the stage for something far greater. Vass could feel it, like the distant tremor of an oncoming storm. The stillness aboard the Veyron felt oppressive, as though the ship itself held its breath. Admiral Aaron Vass stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the hologram of the Resolute, the green icon pulsing like the slow beat of a distant drum. The deck lights flickered faintly, a reminder of the fragile balance between machinery and space. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was brimming with tension, like a taut wire vibrating on the edge of snapping. Lieutenant Venner broke the moment with a clipped tone. "Admiral, the Council has acknowledged your report. They're requesting immediate analysis of the probe's behavior and recommendations for containment." Vass didn't move, his gaze sharp as steel. "Containment? They think we can contain a strategy we don't yet understand?" His voice carried the weight of his frustration, measured but cold. Lieutenant Jass hesitated at his console, his hands hovering over the controls. "The probes have stopped transmitting, but their positions haven't shifted. It's as if they're waiting for something." His fingers danced over the keys, enlarging the probe formations on the secondary display. They formed patterns now, spirals and concentric circles, subtle but deliberate. "Waiting or watching," Vass murmured. The thought burrowed into his mind like a splinter, each passing moment driving it deeper. He turned abruptly, his boots echoing softly against the floor. "Venner, prepare an interceptor drone. I want one of those probes disabled and brought aboard for analysis. If they want to play games, we'll see how they like it when the pieces are on our board." "Yes, Admiral," Venner responded, his voice steady despite the unease threading through the air. The interceptor launched from the Veyron, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of distant stars. Voss watched it streak toward the nearest probe, its trajectory precise and unwavering. The bridge was silent, every officer focused on the unfolding operation. The drone approached the probe with methodical precision, extending its manipulator arms like a surgeon poised for a delicate procedure. As the drone reached the probe, the sleek metallic sphere suddenly pulsed. The light wasn't harsh, but it filled the space with a presence that was almost tangible. On board the Veyron, the faint vibration was felt through the deck plates, like a ripple traveling through their bodies. "Admiral, the probe is responding," Venner exclaimed, his fingers darting over his console. "Energy signatures spiking. Its output is doubling by the second." "Pull the drone back," Vass ordered sharply. "Now!" Before the command could be executed, the probe released a burst of light that wasn't blinding but deeply disorienting. The room seemed to tilt as though gravity itself had shifted. Officers clutched their stations, and for a brief moment, every holographic display across the Veyron flickered. The images fractured into incomprehensible symbols before stabilizing. "What just happened?" Vass demanded, his voice slicing through the confusion. Jas steadied himself, his face pale. "The probe emitted a feedback loop into our systems. It didn't just disrupt the drone, it sent a signal directly to the Resolute." Vass's gaze darkened, his mind racing. The Resolute's green icon pulsed faster on the hologram, its stillness suddenly carrying an air of intent. This wasn't just observation, it was orchestration. "They're not waiting," Vass said, his tone heavy. "They're teaching us to play by their rules." He stepped toward the command table, his fingers tracing the probe patterns displayed before him. The spirals and circles weren't random. They were a language, one that humanity was daring the Council to decipher. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Humanity wasn't sending a message. They were writing one, and it was far from over. Admiral Aaron Vass stood rigid, the soft flicker of holographic light reflecting off his face as his mind wrestled with the implications of what he had just witnessed. The probe's burst of energy had left an imprint on the Veyron, not physical but psychological, like the faint echo of a whisper too distant to understand. His officers moved cautiously, their steps lighter, their voices hushed. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding them all in quiet suspense. "Lieutenant Jas, what's our system status?" Vass asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy atmosphere. "Mostly stable, Admiral," Jas replied, though his tone betrayed the unease gnawing at him. "However, that signal, it didn't just disrupt us. It's still embedded in our secondary systems, looping, like it's waiting to finish something." "Define finish, Lieutenant," Vass demanded, his eyes narrowing. Jas hesitated, then glanced toward Venner, who picked up the thread. "Sir, it's possible the signal is interacting with our data cores, but not destructively. It's—" He paused, searching for the words. "It's like it's leaving behind a pattern. A fingerprint, maybe." "A fingerprint?" Vass repeated, the metaphor pulling his focus to the holographic spiral still glowing faintly on the main display. Its symmetry was haunting, delicate yet deliberate, almost alive. He stepped closer to the table, his boots striking the floor with an unnerving clarity, and gestured toward the symbol. "Overlay this with the probe's current positions. I want to know if they're connected." Venner nodded, his hands working the controls. The screen shifted as the probe's coordinates began to populate the hologram. One by one, they aligned with the edges of the spiral, their placements eerily precise. The display pulsed faintly as the connection became clear. "They're not just observing us," Jas murmured, breaking the silence. "They're building something." A low ripple of unease spread through the bridge. Vass's eyes sharpened, his jaw tightening. He gestured toward Venner again. "Run simulations. What does this configuration imply? And I want it now." Venner's fingers moved swiftly, and the hologram began to shift. The spiral expanded, its edges stretching into a three-dimensional lattice that grew steadily more intricate. Its shape began to suggest depth, volume, a structure far too large and complex to be meaningless. "Admiral," Venner whispered, his voice tinged with awe, "this isn't just a signal or a map. It's a framework, a grid." "A grid for what?" Vass demanded, his voice low and cold, cutting through the awe like a scalpel. Jass's console beeped sharply, pulling his attention. Energy readings from the Resolute are spiking again. They're fueling the probes. It's activating whatever this is. Vass's breath felt heavier, though he forced himself to remain calm. His gaze returned to the green icon of the Resolute, now pulsing in measured bursts. They're forcing our hand, trying to make us respond. What if it's a test? Venner suggested, his tone almost hesitant. Vass shook his head, his voice a razor's edge. It's no test. They've set the stage for something far bigger than us. The grid's glow intensified, its patterns deepening into a form that seemed to move, to breathe. Vass clenched his fists, staring into the shifting lattice, the symbols whispering secrets just out of reach. Whatever humanity had built, it was more than a message. It was a challenge. And it wasn't just meant to be read. It was meant to be answered. The lattice on the holographic display shimmered with an eerie light, shifting and expanding like a living entity unfolding its wings. Admiral Aaron Vass stood motionless, his dark eyes tracing the intricate patterns as they deepened in complexity. The energy emanating from the Resolute fed the probes, each pulse adding a new layer to the structure, turning the void into a canvas for something incomprehensible. "What are we looking at?" Venner asked, his voice subdued but tight with urgency. "Something we don't understand yet," Vass replied, his tone as sharp and steady as a drawn blade. "Jass, is there any indication of what this grid's purpose might be?" Lieutenant Jass's hands hovered over his console, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he navigated the data. "It's interacting with spatial metrics, Admiral. This lattice isn't just occupying space, it's manipulating it. It's bending coordinates almost like it's rewriting the rules," Vass finished, his voice cold. Venner leaned closer to his own station, the light from the holograms casting sharp shadows on his face. "Admiral, if they're bending space, this isn't just a display of power. It could be a containment field, a gateway, or—" He trailed off, his unease palpable. "A weapon," Vass said, the word landing like a hammer. The lattice's glow brightened, and for a moment, the bridge seemed to hum with a sound that wasn't a sound. A pressure, deep and resonant, felt more in the chest than heard. Vass's officers exchanged uneasy glances, their movements jittery, like leaves caught in an unseen current. "Admiral," Venner called out, his voice breaking the tension. "Incoming data spike from the Resolute. They're transmitting something directly to us." "Put it through," Vass ordered, stepping closer to the central console. The main screen flickered, and a cascade of unfamiliar symbols filled the display. They twisted and spiraled, coalescing into a pattern that was maddeningly close to recognition, but remained just out of reach. It was like staring at a dream half-remembered, the meaning tantalizingly close, yet shrouded in shadow. "Are we decoding this?" Vass asked, his voice low but charged. "Not yet," Jass replied, frustration creeping into his tone. "The patterns shift too quickly. It's almost as if they're alive, adapting faster than we can calculate." Vass's jaw tightened as he turned his gaze back to the lattice. The probes were moving now, their positions subtly altering to form new angles within the grid. Each movement seemed purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't just a message. It was a sequence, an unfolding design. "Admiral, should we act?" Venner asked, his words carrying a note of restrained panic. "If they're building something that could harm the fleet—" "No!" Vass cut him off, his voice cold as ice. "We act too soon. We risk playing into their hands. They want us to move blindly. I won't give them that satisfaction." The pressure in the air thickened as the lattice pulsed brighter, its patterns growing into shapes that seemed almost organic. Vass stared at it, his mind working furiously to piece together its purpose. A weapon, a warning, a puzzle. It could be any or all of them. The green icon of the Resolute pulsed steadily on the screen, a beacon of calm amid the chaos it had unleashed. Vass's fist clenched as the weight of the unknown bore down on him. Humanity wasn't just showing its strength. They were playing with the edges of understanding, daring the Council to follow. Vass shook his head, his voice a razor's edge. "It's no test." They've set the stage for something far bigger than us. The grid's glow intensified, its patterns deepening into a form that seemed to move, to breathe. Vass clenched his fists, staring into the shifting lattice, the symbols whispering secrets just out of reach. Whatever humanity had built, it was more than a message. It was a challenge. And it wasn't just meant to be read. It was meant to be answered. The lattice on the holographic display shimmered with an eerie light, shifting and expanding like a living entity unfolding its wings. Admiral Aaron Vass stood motionless, his dark eyes tracing the intricate patterns as they deepened in complexity. The energy emanating from the Resolute fed the probes, each pulse adding a new layer to the structure, turning the void into a canvas for something incomprehensible. "What are we looking at?" Venner asked, his voice subdued but tight with urgency. "Something we don't understand yet," Vass replied, his tone as sharp and steady as a drawn blade. "Jas, is there any indication of what this grid's purpose might be?" Lieutenant Jas's hands hovered over his console, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he navigated the data. "It's interacting with spatial metrics, Admiral. This lattice isn't just occupying space, it's manipulating it. It's bending coordinates almost like it's rewriting the rules," Vass finished, his voice cold. Venner leaned closer to his own station, the light from the holograms casting sharp shadows on his face. "Admiral, if they're bending space, this isn't just a display of power. It could be a containment field, a gateway, or—" He trailed off, his unease palpable. "A weapon," Vass said, the word landing like a hammer. The lattice's glow brightened, and for a moment, the bridge seemed to hum with a sound that wasn't a sound. A pressure, deep and resonant, felt more in the chest than heard. Vass's officers exchanged uneasy glances, their movements jittery, like leaves caught in an unseen current. "Admiral," Venner called out, his voice breaking the tension. "Incoming data spike from the Resolute. They're transmitting something directly to us." "Put it through," Vass ordered, stepping closer to the central console. The main screen flickered, and a cascade of unfamiliar symbols filled the display. They twisted and spiraled, coalescing into a pattern that was maddeningly close to recognition, but remained just out of reach. It was like staring at a dream half remembered, the meaning tantalizingly close, yet shrouded in shadow. "Are we decoding this?" Vass asked, his voice low but charged. "Not yet," Jas replied, frustration creeping into his tone. "The patterns shift too quickly. It's almost as if they're alive, adapting faster than we can calculate." Vass's jaw tightened as he turned his gaze back to the lattice. The probes were moving now, their positions subtly altering to form new angles within the grid. Each movement seemed purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't just a message. It was a sequence, an unfolding design. "Admiral, should we act?" Venner asked, his words carrying a note of restrained panic. "If they're building something that could harm the fleet—" "No!" Vass cut him off, his voice cold as ice. "We act too soon. We risk playing into their hands. They want us to move blindly. I won't give them that satisfaction." The pressure in the air thickened as the lattice pulsed brighter, its patterns growing into shapes that seemed almost organic. Vass stared at it, his mind working furiously to piece together its purpose. A weapon, a warning, a puzzle. It could be any or all of them. The green icon of the Resolute pulsed steadily on the screen, a beacon of calm amid the chaos it had unleashed. Vass's fist clenched as the weight of the unknown bore down on him. Humanity wasn't just showing its strength. They were playing with the edges of understanding, daring the Council to follow. The lattice's glow intensified, and for the briefest moment Vass thought he saw something within it. A shape, a shadow. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only questions in its wake. He turned to face his crew, his voice sharp but controlled. "Whatever the humans are building, it's almost ready. And when it is—" He let the words hang, their weight pressing down on every officer in the room. "We'll be the first to find out if it's meant to destroy us or save us." The lattice's glow reached a crescendo, its light refracting across the bridge of the Veyron like shards of liquid gold. The air felt charged, as if the vacuum outside pressed inward, the silent tension settling heavily on the crew. Admiral Vass's gaze was locked on the holographic grid, its spiraling geometry twisting like the intricate gears of a clock built by a hand far more advanced than their own. "Admiral," Jas began, his voice quieter than usual but firm. "The structure inside the lattice. It's stabilizing. Energy output is leveling out, but—" He hesitated, the words caught on the edge of his tongue. "But what?" Vass prompted, his tone carrying an undercurrent of warning. "It's not a closed system," Jas said at last. "The energy, it's reaching outward. It's not just building something inside the lattice. It's interacting with the space beyond it." The room felt colder at that revelation, as though some unseen current had swept through and stolen a degree of warmth. Vass's fingers curled against the edge of the command console. "Venner, do we have visual confirmation of what's forming in there?" Venner's hands moved quickly, adjusting the external feeds. The central display flickered, then sharpened to reveal the lattice as it truly was, a web of luminous strands wrapping around an object, its surface dark and reflective. The object pulsed faintly, like the beating heart of a predator lying in wait. "It's hollow," Venner said, his voice tight. "And it's expanding." The object's reflective surface rippled as though it were liquid, yet it retained its form, the texture shifting with a hypnotic quality. The lattice didn't just contain it, it nurtured it, each glowing thread feeding into the object like roots sustaining a tree. Vass's expression remained stony, but his voice carried an edge sharper than steel. "What happens if that thing completes its expansion?" "We don't know," Jas admitted, frustration and fear mingling in his tone. "But if the lattice is reaching outward, it could mean—" "Admiral," Venner interrupted, his voice sharp and urgent. "The Resolute is powering up. Energy spikes across the board. It's redirecting its output into the lattice." On the display, the green icon of the Resolute pulsed furiously, its calm presence transformed into something far more aggressive. The lattice responded in kind, its glowing strands tightening and trembling as the object inside began to solidify. "It's a conduit," Jas said, his realization barely more than a whisper. "The Resolute is using the lattice as a bridge." "A bridge to what?" Vass demanded, his voice slicing through the rising panic. Jas swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on his console. "To wherever they want it to go." The object inside the lattice shifted, its surface gleaming with a sharp intensity that seemed to pierce through the holographic display. Vass clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no idea what the humans were building, but he could feel its weight, a heavy looming presence that pressed against the boundaries of understanding. "Alert the fleet," Vass ordered, his voice low and firm. "All ships to defensive positions. If this lattice breaks containment, we won't wait for them to make the first move." Venner relayed the command, his voice steady despite the tension gripping the bridge. Vass turned back to the display, his jaw tightening as the object's pulse grew stronger, its rhythm resonating with a chilling finality. Whatever humanity was creating, it was no longer just a mystery. It was a force waiting to be unleashed, and Vass knew they had precious little time to prepare for the storm it would bring. The lattice shimmered violently, its threads taut and pulsating, as if straining to contain the growing energy coursing through them. Admiral Vass stood unmoving, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the central display. The object at the lattice's core had begun to solidify, dark tendrils of energy arcing along its surface. It was no longer a mystery. It was becoming a force, and its intent was still unknowable. "Status?" Vass barked, his tone clipped. Venner responded without turning, his hands darting over the controls. "Admiral, the Resolute is nearing maximum output. The lattice, it's no longer expanding. It's compressing, forcing all the energy inward." "Into that thing," Vass said, his voice a blade. "What happens when it reaches capacity?" "Unknown, sir," Jas replied from his station. His words carried an edge of helplessness, quickly masked by professionalism. "But the compression rates, Admiral, it's not stable. It's like they're trying to ignite something." Vass's gaze shifted to the screen as the lattice twisted, its glowing strands writhing like a nest of serpents. Every pulse of light seemed to grow brighter, almost blinding, before dimming again into an unnatural stillness. The cycles were quickening, their rhythm no longer predictable. A sudden tremor rippled through the Veyron. It wasn't the ship itself, but something deeper, an invisible distortion rolling through space like a shifting tide. The metallic walls of the command deck seemed to resonate faintly, carrying the weight of the disturbance. "Admiral," Venner called out, urgency sharpening his tone. "Gravitational distortion spiking. It's pulling mass from the surrounding space. Our fleet's trajectories are being affected." Vass clenched his fists. "How far is the effect reaching?" 5 clicks and expanding," Venner replied. "It's like the lattice is drawing everything toward its core. If this continues—" "Get me calculations on how much time we have," Vass cut in. Jas looked up, his face pale but resolute. "Sir, this isn't just a singularity forming. The object, whatever it is, it's stabilizing itself by bending everything else. It's not collapsing. It's consuming," Vass finished grimly. The word hung in the air like an echo, chilling in its simplicity. Vass turned back to the central display, where the Resolute remained eerily still, its green icon unwavering as though it mocked their growing panic. "Admiral," Venner said, his voice quieter now, "there's an incoming transmission. From the Resolute." Vass's gaze snapped to him. "On screen." The display shifted, but instead of a face, only text appeared. It was a single line, stark and simple. "Do not interfere. It is not for you." The words struck Vass like a blow. His breath slowed, his heart pounding with the force of a drumbeat. He clenched his teeth, his mind racing. "What do they mean, not for us?" Venner muttered, breaking the silence. "They're creating something," Vass said, his voice low but deadly. "Something they believe we can't understand. Or stop." His fingers tightened on the edge of the console as the lattice's glow intensified once more. It was no longer a question of what humanity was building. The real question now was what it would do when it was finished. The command deck of the Veyron felt suffocating, the tension coiling tighter with every flicker of the lattice's unnatural light. Admiral Vass stared at the words on the screen. "Do not interfere. It is not for you." The simplicity of the message was a dagger, its meaning cryptic but undeniably hostile. His hands rested on the console, his grip like iron, as if steadying himself against the tide of questions rising in his mind. "Admiral," Venner's voice cut through the heavy air, sharp and controlled. "Energy signatures from the lattice are spiking again. It's starting to fold inward." The holographic lattice twisted, the glowing strands bending and warping with violent precision. Each shift sent ripples across the display, distorting the projections of the fleet's positions. The object within was no longer just solidifying, it was breathing, its surface expanding and contracting like a living entity. "Jas," Vass said, his voice a low command, "analyze the patterns. Are they stable?" Jas's hands moved swiftly over his console, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's not stability, Admiral. It's synchronization. The lattice is resonating with the object, feeding it, but also containing it." He paused, his throat tightening. "If the lattice collapses, whatever's inside will be unleashed." The deck seemed to grow colder as the implications settled over the crew. Vass's gaze remained fixed on the display, his mind racing. "Venner, what's the fleet's current positioning relative to the distortion?" "We're holding formation," Venner replied, his tone edged with unease. "But the gravitational pull is intensifying. Even the outer ships are feeling it now." Before Vass could respond, the lights on the bridge dimmed momentarily, replaced by a pulsing vibration that thrummed through the deck plating. It wasn't sound, but a deep, resonant wave that sank into the bones, stirring an instinctive dread. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, their movements sharp but controlled. "Report," Vass demanded, his voice cutting through the unease. "Admiral," Jas called out, his voice rising, "the lattice is accelerating. Whatever's inside, it's reaching critical mass." On the display, the lattice strands coiled tighter, the light refracting into jagged beams that splintered across the room. The object at the core had transformed, its surface now crystalline and reflecting a kaleidoscope of shifting colors. For a fleeting moment, Vass thought he saw shapes within the reflections, fractals of landscapes and structures, alien and incomprehensible, before they vanished. "Admiral, incoming transmission," Venner interrupted, his voice tense. "It's text again, from the Resolute." The words materialized on the main display, stark and unyielding. "Witness and remember." Vass's chest tightened as the lattice contracted suddenly, its strands pulling inward with a sharp finality. The object within shone brilliantly, illuminating the bridge in an otherworldly glow. The light wasn't just seen, it was felt, a heatless radiance that pressed against the senses like the weight of a distant sun. "Admiral," Jas whispered, his face pale, "it's opening." The object fractured along its surface, jagged lines splitting apart with surgical precision. From the cracks emerged tendrils of light, spiraling outward like liquid fire, weaving patterns that defied logic. The lattice collapsed entirely, leaving the object floating alone, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. "Prepare the fleet," Vass ordered, his voice a steel edge against the chaos. "Weapons charged, shields at maximum. We don't wait to see what it does next." Venner relayed the command, his voice steady despite the tension. The bridge fell silent, save for the rhythmic pulsing of the object on the display. It hovered there, a silent challenge, daring them to understand its purpose. "Witness and remember," Vass murmured to himself, his eyes narrowing. Whatever this was, humanity wasn't just showing their strength. They were forcing the galaxy to see something far greater. And the Veyron was about to find out what. The object floated in the void, its crystalline surface pulsing with an unrelenting rhythm, each beat pushing the limits of understanding. Admiral Vass stood motionless on the command deck, his gaze locked on the central display. The tendrils of light spilling from the fractures writhed like living flames, coiling and spiraling outward into the expanse. They didn't dissipate. They lingered, threading themselves into shapes that shimmered before dissolving into the abyss. "Admiral, fleet is holding steady, but the gravitational anomalies are spreading," Venner reported, his voice sharp. "Outer vessels are adjusting thruster output just to maintain position." "Let them adjust," Vass replied, his tone a tempered blade. "The moment anything from that object moves toward us, we strike." Lieutenant Jas spoke next, his fingers racing over the console. "Sir, the object's energy output is steady now, but the tendrils—" He hesitated as if the words wouldn't come. "They're branching out. It's almost like they're searching." "Searching for what?" Vass demanded, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Jas. "I don't know, Admiral," Jas admitted, his voice tight. "But whatever they are, they're resonating with something. The waves they're emitting, they're not just energy. They're layered frequencies, like overlapping signals trying to synchronize." On the holographic display, the tendrils of light began to shift, their patterns tightening into intricate geometries. The air on the bridge seemed to grow heavier, a silent pressure pressing against the skin. Officers exchanged glances, their unease palpable but controlled. "Venner," Vass ordered, his voice a steady anchor, "send drones into the anomaly. I want close-range visuals and data collection immediately, full spectrum scans, no blind spots." "Yes, Admiral," Venner said, relaying the command without hesitation. The drones launched from the Veyron, their sleek forms gliding through the void like predatory shadows. On the display, their paths converged on the object, their sensors drinking in every detail. As they neared, the tendrils of light shifted again, retracting slightly before surging outward with renewed vigor. "Admiral," Jas called out, his voice edged with alarm. "The tendrils! One of them is moving toward the drones!" The display zoomed in, the tendrils' movement smooth and deliberate, like a predator zeroing in on its prey. It reached the nearest drone, brushing against its surface. The drone's signal cut out instantly, replaced by a cascade of distorted visuals, images fracturing into surreal, impossible shapes before the feed went dark. "Drone disabled," Venner confirmed, his jaw tightening. Another tendril lashed out, striking a second drone. This time, the distortion wasn't visual. It was auditory. The bridge filled with a low, oscillating tone, deep and resonant, vibrating through the deck like the murmur of a distant storm. It wasn't noise. It was communication, alien and incomprehensible. "Shut it down," Vass ordered, his voice cutting through the growing tension. Venner muted the feed, but the memory of the sound lingered, echoing faintly in the minds of the crew. "What are they telling us?" Jas murmured, his eyes fixed on the display. "They're not telling us anything," Vass said, his voice cold. "They're demonstrating." The tendrils of light withdrew, their movements sharp and deliberate, as if satisfied with their actions. The object at the lattice's core pulsed once more, brighter this time, its fractured surface gleaming with unnatural brilliance. Vass felt the weight of its presence like a physical force pressing against him. "Venner," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy. "Send word to the fleet. Maintain defensive positions, but prepare for engagement." "What do we tell them to expect, Admiral?" Venner asked, his voice calm but strained. Vass's gaze lingered on the object, its light reflecting in his dark eyes. "The unexpected," he replied, "and pray it doesn't come too soon." The object pulsed again, sending another ripple through the void, its light bending across the fleet like silent lightning. Admiral Vass stared at the holographic display, his jaw set as the fractured surface of the alien creation gleamed with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the barriers of reason. Each pulse wasn't just energy. It was deliberate, an act of control. "Admiral," Jas said, his voice low but steady, "the drone's data logs, what's left of them, are transmitting back. The tendrils didn't just disable them. They extracted something." Vass turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Extracted what?" Venner stepped in, his expression drawn tight as he analyzed the incoming data. "The drone's memory cores. The object didn't destroy them outright. It absorbed their information. Every scan, every reading, everything they recorded." The words settled over the bridge like an oppressive fog. Vass's gaze returned to the display, his mind racing. "They're not just observing us. They're learning us, cataloging every move we make." The object shifted, its tendrils retracting completely, leaving its crystalline surface stark against the backdrop of the lattice's remnants. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, a void of anticipation that gnawed at the edges of understanding. "Energy readings are fluctuating again," Jas said, his fingers moving swiftly over the console. "It's reconfiguring. The internal structure is changing." The display zoomed in, revealing the intricate patterns within the object's core. They weren't static. They moved like the gears of a celestial machine, twisting and aligning with precision that defied comprehension. The patterns were almost beautiful, but the beauty carried the weight of something unknowable, a force beyond their grasp. "Admiral," Venner called out, his voice breaking the tension, "the Resolute is transmitting again, visual this time." "On screen," Vass ordered, stepping closer to the central console. The image flickered to life, revealing the interior of the Resolute. The bridge was dim, its walls lined with panels that pulsed faintly with blue light. At its center stood a man, tall, composed, his features sharp and commanding. His uniform bore no insignia, only a simple, stark black that seemed to drink in the ambient glow. "I am Commander Holt of the Resolute," the figure said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "You've borne witness to the first phase of our efforts. For now, observe and hold your position. Do not interfere." "What is your purpose, Commander?" Vass asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. Holt's gaze met the screen, his eyes unyielding. "To prepare. This is not an act of aggression, Admiral Vass. It is necessity. Humanity has seen what lies beyond, and we will not face it alone. You and the Council are not ready for what is to come." Before Vass could respond, the transmission cut out, leaving only the fractured object on the screen. Its glow intensified, each pulse faster than the last, as though feeding off the tension in the air. "Admiral," Jas said, his voice rising. "We're detecting a shift in gravitational alignment. The object, it's starting to—" The ship shuddered as another wave rippled outward, this one heavier, more forceful. Voss steadied himself against the console, his teeth gritted as the vibration settled into a low, resonant hum that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. "Prepare the fleet," Voss ordered, his voice hard and unwavering. "If they think we're not ready, we'll prove them wrong." The bridge buzzed with controlled chaos as officers moved to execute the command. Vass's gaze remained locked on the display, his mind sharp and calculating. Humanity hadn't just created an object, they'd forged a warning, and whatever lay ahead, he intended to meet it head-on. The fractured object loomed on the central display, its crystalline form pulsing with deliberate rhythm. Admiral Vass stood at the helm of the command deck, the faint glow casting sharp lines across his face. Every officer moved with precision, the weight of the moment pressing on their shoulders like unseen gravity. Vass's thoughts raced, dissecting the data, calculating outcomes, while the echoes of Commander Holt's cryptic words lingered in his mind. "You are not ready for what is to come." "Jas," Voss ordered, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "What's the status of the gravitational shift?" Jas adjusted the display, his eyes scanning the flood of data. "The object's field is growing more localized, Admiral. It's isolating the immediate area, creating a controlled environment around itself. If it continues, our fleet's maneuverability will be compromised within minutes." "Controlled," Vass muttered, his gaze narrowing. "They're locking us into their terms. We need contingencies." Venner stepped forward, his voice calm but focused. "Admiral, if we attempt to engage directly, we risk triggering whatever they've built into that thing. The lattice may be gone, but its effects are still active. Any aggressive action could destabilize the entire region, or worse." Vass's hand clenched against the edge of the console, the weight of responsibility pressing down. "Then we don't engage recklessly. We strategize. I want every potential vulnerability mapped. Focus on the tendrils. If they're probing, they're also exposing. Find me an opening." "Yes, sir," Venner said, returning to his station with purpose. Jas's voice cut through the tension. "Admiral, there's an anomaly in the object's energy patterns. It's subtle, but there's a delay between its pulses and the gravitational shifts. It's not instantaneous." Vass turned sharply. "How significant is the delay?" "Milliseconds," Jas replied. "But enough to suggest the system isn't fully synchronized yet. It's still calibrating." Vass's mind latched onto the detail, weaving it into a plan. If it's calibrating, it's vulnerable. We exploit that window. Venner, coordinate with the fleet. Deploy secondary drones at high speed. Focus on creating distortion within the anomaly's perimeter. Force it to recalibrate faster than it's designed to handle. Venner glanced up, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "Admiral, if we force a miscalibration and it destabilizes—" "We risk everything," Vass finished for him, his tone steel. "But waiting means ceding control to them. This is our only move." The bridge erupted into coordinated motion. Officers relayed orders with sharp efficiency, their voices steady even as tension rippled beneath the surface. On the central display, the fleet adjusted formation, creating a wide perimeter around the anomaly. Sleek drones launched from the vessels, their trajectories sharp and precise, weaving through the distortion field like arrows seeking their mark. The object pulsed again, brighter this time, its tendrils lashing outward in response. The drone's movements were erratic, designed to mimic unpredictability, disrupting the rhythm of the object's calibration. "Admiral, gravitational patterns are destabilizing," Jas reported, his tone clipped. "The object's synchronization is faltering." "Maintain pressure," Vass commanded, his gaze unyielding. "Don't let it recover." The bridge trembled as another wave rippled through space, sharper and more chaotic than before. On the display, the object's glow dimmed briefly, its fractured surface flickering as if struggling to hold itself together. "Admiral," Venner said, urgency creeping into his voice. "The Resolute is responding. Energy spikes across their systems. They're compensating for the disruption." Vass's lips pressed into a thin line. "They're not ready for us either," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "Increase the pressure. If they're compensating, we make them bleed energy faster than they can recover. This ends before they regain control." The drones intensified their assault, weaving closer to the anomaly, each calculated burst of interference pushing the object further out of alignment. The tendrils recoiled, their movements erratic, and for the first time, the object seemed less like an unshakable force and more like something struggling to survive. "Admiral," Jas said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "it's working. The object is destabilizing." Vass's eyes remained fixed on the display. "Good. But we're not done yet." The object flickered erratically, its fractured surface dimming under the relentless interference of the drones. Admiral Vass stood at the center of the command deck, his shoulders taut and his sharp gaze fixed on the display. The calculated chaos of their assault was working, each distortion forcing the anomaly further from its calibrated stability. But the Resolute loomed, its energy spikes surging like a heart under strain, pumping power into the unraveling lattice. "Admiral, the object's synchronization has dropped by 20%, Jas reported, his tone clipped but laced with urgency. "It's not stable, but the Resolute is compensating faster than we anticipated. Their energy reserves are deeper than we calculated." Vass's brow furrowed. Deeper doesn't mean infinite. They're playing a long game, but they've committed to this fight. Find me a way to cut that connection. Venner adjusted his station, his movements precise. "Admiral, their energy transfer is routed through focused tendrils, but it's not a direct link. They're using a phased modulation, likely to protect the Resolute from feedback if the object fails." Vass turned sharply toward Venner. "If it's not direct, that's our opening. Can we disrupt the modulation?" "Yes, sir," Venner replied, his voice steady. "But it would require coordinated strikes along the modulation points. We'll need precision timing, too early or too late, and it won't collapse the transfer." "Do it," Vass ordered. "Relay targeting data to the fleet. I want 3 strike teams positioned and ready to fire simultaneously. We dismantle that connection before they can stabilize." The bridge moved with seamless efficiency. Orders were transmitted, ships shifted into formation, and targeting data cascaded across the holographic display. The fleet's firepower, held in tense reserve until now, was being positioned with surgical intent. "Admiral," Jas interjected, his voice tight, "gravitational distortion is spiking again. The object's instability is causing localized spatial folds. Our drones are being pulled off course." Vass's gaze hardened. "Redirect drone control to manual piloting. Assign our best operators and focus on maintaining the interference pattern. We can't afford to let up now." The hologram lit up as 3 squadrons moved into their strike positions, their weapons trained on the shimmering tendrils connecting the Resolute to the anomaly. The lattice glowed brighter, its erratic pulses growing faster, the light refracting like shards of broken glass scattered across the void. "Strike teams in position," Venner confirmed. Vass stepped closer to the console, his voice a calm command. "Fire on my mark." The seconds stretched, the bridge silent except for the faint hum of data feeds. The tendrils writhed like serpents in a dying storm, their movements unpredictable but exposed. "Mark!" The fleet's weapons fired in unison, streaks of energy slicing through the void with deadly precision. The strikes hit their targets with devastating accuracy, severing the tendrils in bursts of light and energy. The object trembled violently, its fractured surface cracking further as the lattice collapsed inward. "Direct hits," Venner called out. "The connection is severed. The Resolute is disengaging from the anomaly." On the display, the Resolute pulled back, its energy spikes diminishing. The object dimmed, its pulsing slowing as though gasping for life. Vass's jaw tightened as he studied the scene. "This isn't over yet. Stay alert. Whatever their next move is, we'll be ready." The bridge settled into a tense quiet, the weight of their actions heavy but resolute. The battle wasn't won, but they had landed the first blow. Now it was time to prepare for the storm that was sure to follow. The fractured object hung in the void, its once brilliant tendrils reduced to faint flickers as the severed lattice unraveled around it. The fleet maintained a tight formation, every ship poised and ready to fire. On the Veyron's bridge, the air was electric with anticipation, as though the universe itself held its breath. Admiral Vass stood rigid, his eyes locked on the dimming light of the anomaly. Victory felt close, but the void offered no promises, only the faint echo of uncertainty. "Admiral," Jas said, his voice taut, "the anomaly is destabilizing further. Its energy levels are dropping rapidly, but I don't think it's dying. It's restructuring." Vass turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Restructuring into what?" "I don't know," Jas admitted, his fingers flying over the console. "But the patterns. There's intention behind them. It's not collapsing, Admiral. It's preparing." Before Vass could respond, Venner's voice cut through. "Admiral, the Resolute is transmitting again. Commander Holt wants to speak." Vass straightened, his jaw tightening. "Put him through." The main display shifted to reveal Holt's face, his expression calm but resolute, his eyes carrying an intensity that spoke of deep conviction. Behind him, the Resolute's bridge hummed with activity, its crew a blur of calculated precision. "Admiral Vass," Holt began, his tone even, "you've proven your fleet's capability and determination. Humanity does not take that lightly." "Spare me the compliments," Vass snapped, his voice a razor's edge. "What is this anomaly, and why are you risking the galaxy to create it?" Holt tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "This anomaly, as you call it, is a beacon, a message, a reminder to forces that would prey on our galaxy that humanity will not stand idle." "A message?" Vass's voice dropped, each word cutting. "To whom? You're risking the lives of every species in the galaxy for a message?" Holt's calm facade fractured, his voice rising with sudden force. "To powers you cannot yet comprehend. We've seen the edges of their shadow, Admiral. We've felt their gaze, cold and unyielding. Humanity has been preparing for 50 years for their return, and this—" He gestured off-screen toward the anomaly. "This is our line in the sand." The Resolute's bridge dimmed momentarily, and Holt leaned closer to the screen, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you think we sent only one ship to intimidate you? One ship unarmed into the heart of your fleet? We sent one ship to show you what comes next, to force you to see the truth. Because if you're not ready, we all die." The bridge of the Veyron was deathly silent, Holt's words hanging in the air like a blade poised to fall. Vass's jaw tightened, his mind racing. What happens if this beacon fails? Holt's voice turned cold. "Then you'll wish you had joined us sooner." The transmission cut abruptly, leaving the screen dark. Outside, the anomaly pulsed faintly, its dim light taking on a sharper, more menacing hue. Vass turned to his officers, his voice calm but carrying the weight of steel. "Prepare all ships. Whatever happens next, we're not standing alone." The bridge of the Veyron held its collective breath as the anomaly pulsed one last time. The fractured tendrils of light had stilled, their chaotic writhing replaced by a sinister calm. Admiral Vass's gaze never wavered, his mind sharpening with each passing second. The fleet's formation was tight, their weapons trained on the dark crystalline object that had become the center of the galaxy's most dangerous mystery. "Admiral," Jas called out, his voice steady but low, "energy levels within the anomaly are stabilizing. Whatever it's doing, it's reached equilibrium." Vass's jaw tightened, his voice cutting through the tension. "And the Resolute?" "Stationary," Venner replied, his fingers gliding over his console. "No further energy output. Their systems are holding steady, but their shields are at maximum. They're waiting." "They want us to make the first move," Vass murmured, his tone laced with contempt. "But we won't play into their hands." Before anyone could respond, the object began to glow again, its light sharper, more focused. It wasn't chaotic anymore. It was purposeful. A deep vibration passed through the Veyron, not physical, but something deeper, resonating in their very bones. The anomaly's surface cracked further, and from within its crystalline depths, a new form began to emerge. A sudden voice broke the silence. It wasn't from the bridge, nor the Resolute. It filled the room like a whisper woven into their thoughts. "You have seen. Now choose." "Admiral," Jas stammered, his voice faltering, "that That came directly from the anomaly. It's aware. Vass's expression hardened. Of course it's aware. This isn't just a machine, it's a message made flesh. He turned toward the display, his voice rising. What choice are you offering us? The light intensified, and for a moment the bridge was bathed in a blinding brilliance. As it receded, the anomaly was gone, replaced by a singular, perfect sphere, smooth and dark as the void itself. Around it, holographic projections flared to life, displaying impossible constellations, alien symbols, and structures that seemed to twist reality itself. The voice returned, cold yet compelling. Humanity understands the cost of ignorance. This is a key, a doorway to knowledge, to strength. But it requires unity, not division. Will you stand with us or fall apart? Vass's fists clenched, the weight of the question pressing down on him like a crushing tide. Holt's warning echoed in his mind. If this beacon fails, you'll wish you had joined us sooner. Admiral, Venner said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension, if we align with them, we risk losing control. But if we don't... Vass stepped closer to the display, his voice carrying the weight of decision. We've already lost control. This isn't a negotiation. It's survival. Humanity has forced us to see the truth. One ship, one challenge, and they've brought the galaxy to its knees. He turned to his officers, his voice unwavering. Send the message. We align with the Resolute, but we do it on our terms. The sphere's glow softened, and for a moment the void itself seemed to quiet, as though acknowledging their answer. Voss straightened, his expression resolute. Humanity hadn't come with weapons or threats. They had come with proof. Proof that even one ship sent with purpose could rewrite the course of history. In the silence that followed, Voss allowed himself a fleeting thought, one that carried equal parts awe and fear. They didn't send one ship because it was all they had. They sent one because it was all they needed.